U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research, the mission is optimizing combat casualty care. The command is unique in the sense that I have, a pretty large research department, but I also have the only DoD American Burn Association accredited burn unit. So you have, kind of half the command is this high-end research for combat casualty care, and the other is, high-end clinical care. Burn patients oftentimes are the sickest patients, really on the planet. And then furthermore, within the burn unit, we also have the burn flight teams. So we have this capability where we can send out a team, usually a 5-person team, to travel anywhere in the world, take over the care of that burn patient on site and then move them to an Air Force aircraft and fly them back to San Antonio. So it's a combination of research, clinical care, and then also an operational component.
Yeah, that's amazing. So can you tell us more about that flight team? Where they have like a 2-hour response time and they have to be ready to go anywhere?
Sure. So it's actually 18 hours.
18 hours.
They could probably go in 2, but they need a ride.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So that depend on the aircraft. Usually a burn flight team is a 5-person team.
Okay.
That's made up of a burn surgeon, 2 ICU nurses, a respiratory therapist, and then oftentimes an LPN. That's kind of the NCOIC of that team. They take their own equipment with them, packed in Pelican cases. So, and oftentimes they will fly commercial to get to the site. It also makes that movement a little quicker sometimes.
Yeah.
They'll fly back on an Air Force, aircraft, often in conjunction potentially with a CCAT team, but they really provide that continuous burn resuscitation and that critical care in and out.
Yeah, that's impressive. And then, okay, so with that, there's this other technology that we're pretty good at, ECMO. Is that also a part of that mission?
So it can be, if needed. In the event the patient needs ECMO, which is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, we do that in conjunction with the BAMC ECMO team. And then also, our burn flight teams will respond for patients, CONUS as well, especially in the state of Texas.
Wow. Okay, tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to the ISR.
Yeah, so I'm a general surgeon. I'm actually the general surgery consultant. So I started my career in El Paso, Texas, where I did my general surgery residency. After that, I went to Fort Hood for a couple of years and deployed to Afghanistan for the first time in 2013. Came back from that deployment, finished out my time at Fort Hood, went to New Orleans at the Ochsner Clinic for a year actually did a colorectal fellowship. And then after that, I went back to El Paso as teaching staff for just a year, and then I was recruited to come to Fort Bragg to be part of the Joint Medical Augmentation Unit. I joined that organization in 2016, transitioned to Fort Bragg in 2017, and then I was at Fort Bragg for several years. During that time, I worked obviously with Joint Special Operations Command as part of the Joint Medical Augmentation Unit, but I also was the General Surgery Program Director. We stood up a new residency program for general surgery at Womack Army Medical Center, and then I was the Chief of Surgery. And then I was looking at my career and trying to decide, hey, I'm going to do 20 and get out like a lot of docs do, or if not, what's the next step for me? I had the opportunity to go to Army War College. I was actually a fellow. There's a fellowship program through the Army War College, so I was a fellow at the VA, which was a great experience. Yeah. And then after that, came back to Fort Bragg. I was the Chief of Professional Services for the 44th Medical Brigade, and I kind of tell people that was a master class in operational medicine, working at the 44th. I was there just less than a year, and I got pulled up to be the 18th Airborne Corps Command Surgeon. And the plan was to do that until this summer when I was going to assume command, but I ended up assuming command of the ISR early. So I took command in November.
So we've talked about the ISR and their strong, like this clinical mission that they have, and you have this very strong operational and clinical background. So what have you learned coming in about their research focus? And so what are the strengths? Because, I can think of other DoD medical research groups, but I think of ISR as a very special one. And so I'm just curious your perspective now, having come in, seen it all.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, certainly growing up in Army surgery, you heard about the ISR. In fact, when I was a general surgery resident, I rotated in the burn unit for a month as a fourth-year resident. So certainly understood kind of the legacy and the contributions that the organization had provided to the warfighter and to combat casualty care. Taking over as a commander, one of the things, again, coming from the operational standpoint, understanding that S&T does take time, but trying to establish a sense of urgency with that research. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, taking over and establishing my priorities, the team has just bought into it. I kind of I joke with the team and thought I'd maybe be the guy rolling the rock up the hill, but absolutely not. The team is all in. The researchers are all about it. They understand the mission. They understand the why. And also I think but bringing that operational background and then making further operational connections allows us to maybe more quickly identify capability gaps and then find ways to address those capability gaps.
Do you have like a handful of key capabilities, like research strengths that you would say ISR is the go-to for?
We do. I would say, our strengths are, I think classically our strengths are, blood substitutes, blood research, right? I kind of jokingly say, we have one department that's the blood department, which in trauma patients it's stop bleeding and give blood. We also have the stop bleeding department, right? So think, tourniquets, tourniquet conversion, hemostatic agents. I think that's obviously critical. But quite frankly, one of our departments that's been doing a lot recently is our organ support and automated technology department. So it's, if you think about large-scale combat operations, there's a lot of challenges with that from a combat casualty care standpoint. Human physiology really hasn't changed, but it's our ability to, augment or leverage the medical care that is there to provide the most good for the most patients. So with that in mind, it's, think decision support, devices and technology that helps our medics, manage more patients. It's autonomous systems, whether it's autonomous ventilators or autonomous IV pumps that allow, maybe a medic or a nurse to take care of more patients at one time. And then ultimately the goal is when we think about, the autonomous vehicles, whether that's air or ground, how do we care for a patient en route if they're on an autonomous system? Yeah. If we don't have a medic in the back of that vehicle, how do we care for that patient? One of the stories I share with the team is, recently, there was a successful UGS evacuation of an injured Ukrainian, and it took several attempts and several hours to evacuate that patient. And it was, again, thankfully successful. But that patient, was basically a walking wounded at that point. And so I look at, our systems, and without being able to provide en route care, we can't really put a sick patient on the back of one of those aircraft unless we have some type of autonomous medical support en route as well. Yeah. And so it's partnering with industry, but it's also partnering with USROL, which is one of our other research labs, and leveraging their knowledge of en-route care and really trying to get after that autonomous movement.
Okay, so you mentioned medic a few times, and I think one of the strengths of San Antonio is that all medics get their initial training here at METC. So we have this benefit of being able to connect to that campus and then have real-time discussion and feedback about the training pipeline, new technologies coming. Do you have experiences with that? How does ISR engage with METC?
Yeah, so I would say that, just to take a step back, as a general surgeon, throughout my deployments and certainly throughout the global war on terror, the surgical teams were kind of the center of medical gravity. And I think towards LISCO, while surgical teams are going to be critical, right, because of the evacuation times potentially and the number of patients, I really think, in my personal opinion, that our medics and our combat lifesavers will be the center of gravity. And so it's trying to leverage, it's leverage and support them to up their game, if you will, in a way, to provide that care. And so how do we partner with that? One is we do have close ties with Medco, and it's so while the ISR oftentimes is looked at as a material solution, also understanding that the technology we develop there's going to be training that goes along with that. So providing that expertise to Medco as if we potentially roll out new technology, what does that training piece look like for those medics so they can actually use that technology for the most benefit?
So you were at Beaumont Hospital, right?
Yeah.
Do you know, I did this deep dive because who's this named after? Do you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, so let's hear about Beaumont.
Yeah, so William Beaumont was a physician in the Civil War, right? And I'm blanking on his name. It's a French name, but he had a patient that had basically a gut shot and developed a gastrocutaneous fistula. And he cared for him, but at the same time, he also used it as an opportunity to kind of further understand, abdominal physiology in regards to, digestion of proteins and everything. Yeah. So,
but he's one of those things that we reference because we learned a lot, but you can never do it today. It's
absolutely
totally unethical.
not. No, you cannot. You cannot. You know, interesting. I'm from St. Louis, and if I remember correctly, William Beaumont, towards the end of his career, slipped on ice in St. Louis, got a subdural hematoma, was actually buried in St. Louis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not too far from where I grew up. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I just remember reading, it was like Mackinac Island. He was a surgeon out there. The guy got shot.
Yeah.
And then he would just like dip stuff in there and just see.
Yeah.
And then he kind of like captured the guy. Like that guy tried to run away and he would send the army to go retrieve him. So
yeah, it's really, medical and surgical history is, interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm glad you